I see my man in the background, the one, the only Caleb Maupin. How you doing,
Hey, how you
Caleb?
doing?
You doing okay? I am doing okay. You having a good morning so far?
Good. Me too.
Good. Well, no, it's morning for you. It's evening for me. It's like it's nighttime for me. I was just checking on you, making sure everything was good. I'm Caleb Maupin. He's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author. Caleb is director for CPI, Center for Political Innovation. They are very busy as opposed to some of these other, let's say, less active, quote unquote, organizations. Caleb, thank you for joining me, man. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
I guess the first thing I have to hit is this oil piracy, which seems to be outrageous. You have U.S. troops rappelling off of helicopters onto the boat of a ship. I believe it was an Iranian ship, if I'm not mistaken. This is outrageous. Like, what? Why do you think up to this point Trump hasn't, let's say, launched his military? I mean, the military has been sitting in the Caribbean for what, over a month, just spinning their wheels. Do you think that there is, regardless of all the bluster, that there is this awareness somewhere in the administration, whether it's from the military itself or whether it's from people around them saying this is a horrible idea. There is no win to this. This is a trap. You like, meaning this is a fail. There's no way for you to look good in this process.
Well, it looks to me, I must say, and I don't want to jinx it, as they say, right? But I feel like if they were going to invade, they would have done it by now. I mean, it's been since August. They've been playing these games. They've sunk how many ships, and they've been engaging in so many provocations. I feel like they're trying to do everything short of actually attacking or invading Venezuela. It looks to me like they're thinking of what else can we do, and they're kind of scraping the barrel for different things to do at this point. But I mean, this is just an act of theft. There's no justification for this. It's not legal. I mean, Venezuela is an oil producing country. And if they're exporting their oil and then you just, send the U.S. Navy to seize it, that's called theft. I mean, this has been done before. I believe the Biden administration did a similar thing with seizing one of their oil tankers. I think Trump did some similar things before, but it's theft. I mean, it's just that plain and simple. And that there's this argument that we hear from the United States, basically, that if we have sanctions on somebody and we therefore are allowed to stop financial transactions they have with somebody else. I don't know how that legally stands up, but they claim basically, if we put sanctions on one person and we then can stop them trading from somebody else. No, you can't. That's not how that works. Sanctions are about your own business transactions, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, it's very weird, very strange. There would not be consequences for it. I mean, I often get into arguments with people saying about international law. And my argument was always, there is no such thing as international law. And when stuff like this happens, it's things like this that I point to. If there is international law, what are the consequences for the United States of doing this? There are none. Might makes right. Or do you disagree with me on this?
No, I don't disagree with you. Don't disagree with you at all. And that's the same people always screaming about a rules-based global order. And it's like, when the talking points change every so often, right? They get a new talking point, the rules-based global order or international law or international human rights or duty to protect. And they have all these like things. But at the end of the day, and then the USA just seizes an oil tanker and just says, nope, it's ours. We don't like Maduro, so whatever. Or the USA invades Iraq. And what was the legal basis for that? Well, it was that Iraq had rejected a UN inspection team that had been engaging in illegal activities and provocations. And so based on that, the USA said they had the right to unilaterally invade a country after the United Nations Security Council told them not to. I mean, and then when there's a U.S. military intervention, often they say, well, we have to just enforce international law. And it's just like the USA violates international law all the time. I used to work for Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, and he was a huge critic of the International Criminal Court. And he said, look, if there had been any talk of an International Criminal Court, the UN would never have been formed. All the countries would have rejected it because it would have been seen as a potential threat to their sovereignty. And that's one place where Ramsey Clark, who's from the left, I mean, he was the U.S. Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson. And, he was from the left, a civil rights activist. He ended up becoming, an anti-imperialist, basically a communist after he left the Johnson administration. And, but that's one thing he agreed with Republicans on pretty solidly, was that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is completely illegal and illegitimate. It has absolutely no legal basis. The idea of you could set up a court in The Hague that has jurisdiction for the entire world is absurd. And one thing that is not widely pointed out, so the ICC, the International Criminal Court, it was George Soros who was one of the main people pushing it. And there was first the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia, and that was part of dismantling, former Yugoslavia. But that wasn't the ICC. The ICC had not been set up yet. Now that the ICC has been set up, every single person ever convicted in it is African. And that is one aspect of the ICC that you look at it is just so blatantly a colonial institution through which, the European powers can declare somebody on the African continent to be committing genocide or crimes against humanity and arrest them. I mean, it is a really blatantly colonial institution, and it has absolutely no legal basis. There is absolutely no legal basis for the International Criminal Court. And so we talk about international law. I mean, there are treaties that have been signed, et cetera, but it's all very much a matter of who can get away with what and what the balance of forces are at any given time, unfortunately.
Absolutely. This is, and by the way, this was Donald Trump responding about the seizure of the tanker. Listen to what he says here. I mean, he's all over the map in regards to this explanation.
Drugs, or is it now also about oil? Well, it's about a lot of things, but one of the things it's about is the fact that they've allowed millions of people to come into our country from their prisons, from gangs, from drug dealers, and from mental institutions, probably proportionately more than anybody else. They came in from many countries. We're getting them out. We had 11,888 murderers come into our country. Many of them are from Venezuela. We had thousands of Tren de Aragua, the gang, come in from, which they say is the most violent gang. I don't know, MS-13 is pretty bad, but Tren de Aragua, they say, is the most violent gang that comes from the prisons of Venezuela. It came out of the prisons of Venezuela. So it has to do with a lot of things. They've treated us badly, and I guess now we're not treating them so good. If you look at the drug traffic by sea is down 92%. And nobody can figure out who the 8% is, because I have no idea. Anybody getting involved in that right now is not doing well. And we'll start that on land too. It's going to be starting on land pretty soon. Thank you.
That's outrageous. Outrageous. Give me your take on this.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, I've heard claims that this Tren de Aragua doesn't really exist.
It doesn't exist. It's a CIA cutout.
Yeah. It's a gang that existed like decades ago that doesn't exist, and that like the basis for some of the people being accused of being in it is they're from Aragua, right, which is a region in Venezuela. And so it's like, well, then, Aragua, Tren de Aragua, and it's just crazy things like that. And then they're using the cartel of the Suns, and I've seen Max Blumenthal's work, showing that that's not illegal. That's a ridiculous thing, and that was a group that worked with the CIA years ago. And also this thing about all these Venezuelans that came here, I do have some questions about that. Because first of all, they're from Venezuelan prisons, right? So these are not Maduro's supporters, right? It's not, if Maduro has you in prison, you're not like Maduro's, biggest, supporters, are not the people in the prisons, number one. Mm-hmm. But number two, who let them in, right? And that's, I feel like, there is this policy in the United States. I believe we have laws that if you're coming from a quote unquote communist dictatorship, they'll let you into the country. So there were a lot of things that just didn't add up about, in the lead up to the 2024 elections, there were these Venezuelans that were coming into the United States that would do really outrageous things that would get a lot of media attention, that would make people really mad at migrants and immigrants, right? And so what was going on? Well, I mean, it was almost like they were letting in some very nasty Venezuelans and then putting them places where they would do really nasty things and publicizing it. And then somehow we're to blame that on Maduro. Why are we blaming that on Maduro? I mean, these are people Maduro didn't like. These are people that were in Maduro's prison. So I And then why are we letting them in? Like, there's a lot of questions there. Something was going on where these kind of these Venezuelans would be put up in a hotel someplace, and they would, punch old ladies and, steal candy from babies, and just do awful things. And then the media would say, oh, look at these awful migrants, and now we're supposed to be attacking them because Maduro sent them here. Like, well, that's not how it works. I mean, he doesn't just send people here. The USA has to take them in, and something was off. Do you remember that whole thing about like the Venezuelan migrants in all these big cities? And it was like they would do very, very bizarre and very, very public bad things, right? It was very weird.
Well, from my understanding, the Biden administration, so the whole Venezuela thing was weird, especially in the Biden administration where they were letting people in because oftentimes they didn't know who was coming in. Mm-hmm. We don't have a trade. We don't have let's say a treaty with Venezuela in this case.
Right.
So, and we don't have a relationship with Venezuela in this case. So there was no way to know who Joe Biden is effectively letting into the country. It wasn't just Venezuela, it was a few countries like this. And of course, Joe Biden came up with the scheme of, it's like you sign into an app. And then once you do, it was very strange in the way that this was effectively working. By the same token, under US law, if you are fleeing what you consider to be political persecution, you can get grandfathered into the country.
Right.
So I don't know. He seems to be leaning on this idea. I don't believe for a moment that they open up Venezuelan jails and let people into the United States. I don't buy that at all, any more than I buy drug traffic over the seas is down 92%, any more than I buy the Trump economy is the greatest economy in the history of America. Not all of the stuff. We've made $20 trillion in investments into America. None of this stuff is true.
Okay.
At least that's my take. I mean, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong.
No, I don't think you're wrong.
Yeah, it's just it's just my take on it. But yeah, he's living off this, and he's living off this in a way where he's trying to effectively use this as a justification for, I guess, policy. But you might be right. He hasn't necessarily taken the step of going after, let's say, kinetic military action yet, which, fingers crossed. I just don't know how he backs away from it at this point. You mentioned something about Ramsey Clark, about the ICC.
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump, an article just came out, I think this was yesterday, that Donald Trump is demanding that the ICC rewrite their rules to effectively protect that same Donald Trump. And you can imagine why. Trump has been murdering people in the Caribbean willy-nilly, there's just mass murder. And so if the ICC actually looks at this and says, well, hey, the U.S., Trump specifically, Hegseth, has a policy of mass murder in the Caribbean, maybe we want to go after the U.S. president. Now, I don't buy that they would have the balls to do this. By the same token, though, Trump apparently is concerned and is demanding that they effectively rewrite the rules to shield his administration, which is astonishing. And right here, just to nail down the story, Washington's preparing or is pressuring the International Criminal Court to amend its founding statute to block any future attempts to prosecute U.S. President Donald Trump or his single officials, Reuters reported, citing administration sources. That's amazing.
Well, it's not just, that's nothing new, though. There's the Hague Act, which was passed by Congress, that the USA actually has the right to invade the Hague if they ever prosecute an American. The USA has never kind of given it any legitimacy. And that there's an element with the ICC that, as much as it is very much a colonial institution, it's also something that the European powers are pushing, and a lot of the United States, especially Republicans, don't like. The Bush administration didn't seem to like the ICC. And that, the Democrats seem to be a bit more favorable towards it. And it's the British, it's the French, the Germans, the Belgians, it's the European mainland powers that seem to be behind it. And there's an element of the American, state that has always felt it was illegitimate and didn't trust it. And this is where it gets very, very interesting. I have spent a long time investigating kind of the rivalry between various imperial powers. You remember freedom fries. Remember freedom fries, right? When we hated the French, right? And that was a big part of being a good American patriot who supported the invasion of Iraq, is you had to hate the French. And that there's a lot of weird things that have gone on. For example, the French government is a huge supporter of nuclear power. And so much so that the French government, their nuclear power industry is government run. The founder of it, the physicist who started the French nuclear power industry, was a communist party member. And France not only has nuclear power, but they export nuclear power. And Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, early 80s, he was setting up a nuclear power facility. And the French government sent scientists there, and they were helping Saddam Hussein to develop nuclear power. And then Israel bombed Iraq and killed not only a bunch of Iraqi scientists, but actually a French citizen when France was working with Saddam Hussein to develop peaceful nuclear energy. And on top of that, Greenpeace is this like environmental activist group that is against nuclear power and is against big oil. And I believe in the 1980s, the French government and French intelligence blew up a ship of Greenpeace activists that were working against French interests. And later, it's confirmed it was like a hit done by the French government. And that there, an inter-imperialist rivalry between, France and the United States. There's a long-standing trend there. And one thing that I have done a lot of investigation of, and this is a big part of my book about the years of lead, I even wrote an appendix about it, is that it seems that the French government has gone out of its way to recruit a lot of leftists around the world as assets, right? French intelligence, as the Soviet Union was losing its influence in the late 80s, French intelligence seemed to have, picked up and recruited a number of leftists to be assets. One example, for example, this is very interesting, is the case of Mumia Abu Jamal. Do you know Mumia Abu Jamal? Right? Yeah, I believe Mumia Abu Jamal is innocent, a former Black Panther who was accused of killing a police officer and is in prison today. And they tried to give him the death penalty in 1995. Well, the French government seems to have been the primary force behind trying and ultimately successfully preventing Mumia's execution. Because the French government is committed to abolishing the death penalty. There are streets in Paris named after Mumia Abu Jamal. Mumia has been declared a French citizen by the French government. And it seems like France was the main force trying to prevent the execution and ultimately was successful in doing so. And and it's particularly fascinating. The other thing is the French government in the 80s, they launched a policy of allowing communists from around the world that were fleeing government persecution or criminal charges to move to France. And there are hundreds of former members of the Italian Red Brigades, which was the terrorist group in Italy, the communist terrorist group. Hundreds of them moved to France and lived there and still live there and have complete immunity. They're not being extradited and all of that. That's very, very interesting. There's also an interesting case of, have you ever heard of the unicorn killer, Ira Einhorn?
No.
Okay, so in Philadelphia, there was this well-known hippie leftist environmental activist named Ira Einhorn, and his girlfriend went missing, and his apartment was smelling really, really bad. And so the police searched his apartment, and they found his girlfriend there mummified. He had killed his girlfriend, allegedly. So the guy, was charged with murder, and he was really well connected, and members of city council and other prominent people said, give him bail. He got bail, and then he disappeared. And his bail was paid for by, I believe, the Brofman family, which is one of like the very, very wealthy families in Canada, like that owns, a liquor company or something like that. And he was missing for decades, Ira Einhorn. For decades, no one knew where he was. And finally, in the early 2000s, they found him in France. He was living in France under a different name. And then the French government put up a fight like crazy to prevent him from being extradited back to the United States. The state of Pennsylvania basically had to pass a special law that said if someone is charged with murder, flees the United States, moves to France, Pennsylvania will not give them the death penalty. And on that basis, the French government finally had to give in when they passed a special law and extradite him to the United States. Right? It was the most bizarre case ever, right? Where the French government did everything they could to keep Ira Einhorn in France. And he was living there under a false name, and he had all kinds of connections. The other thing that's weird is when Ira Einhorn came back to the United States, his defense was, I didn't kill my girlfriend. The CIA did. I don't think he was necessarily telling the truth there, but he then revealed, he read into the record all kinds of information about MK Ultra and all kinds of stuff. And it looks like he, you know, the reason he was rushed out of the country and had like the Brofman family and all these prominent Democrats, you know, help him get bail and all of that was he did have some kind of intelligence connection. He wasn't just a guy. Right. And he was the guy who had been the MC at the Earth Day celebrations when Earth Day. He was widely described as the guy who invented the holiday of Earth Day. And he was this very, very prominent counterculture hippie. And he was rushed out of the United States and harbored by the French government for many, many decades. And they put up a fight like crazy to prevent his extradition. I mean, it took 10 years at least for the U.S. government to finally get him from France. And that the French government, it appears that as the Soviet Union was losing influence, a lot of leftist and communist groups started to become assets of French intelligence. And I think that explains why now that the USA and France are unified against Russia, a lot of the left is completely impotent. They're not standing with, it's that they became assets. And I wrote this, and I wrote another piece about this. And a number of people came to me and they said, you don't know how right you are. Apparently in Russia, when the special military operation got going in 2022, almost like all the Trotskyite communists in Russia got on a plane and went to Paris.
Are you serious?
I am serious. And I didn't even know that at the time that I wrote about this. And the other thing was that, I mean, I knew for a fact that a lot of the money for the Mumia case came from France, right? And that I knew a lot of the communist groups in America, they would just go to France and fundraise like crazy for the Mumia case. And that France was against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And you remember like Michael Moore, when he did Fahrenheit 9/11, they gave him the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. And they made it like France was really, really pushing Fahrenheit 9/11. And Harold Pinter, the playwright, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he made a big point of like giving a long speech against George W. Bush when he won the Nobel Prize. And then the French government like gave him the Legion d'Honneur or whatever. And that it was clear that the French and the U.S. government, they weren't getting along. And that France had kind of turned a lot of leftist activists around the world into assets. I mean, people don't realize this, but in France, the French Communist Party is like part of the government. They are, and they're a legal political party that has, a huge amount of seats in the French government, but they're not communists. They cut ties with the Soviet Union in 1978. They're basically like Bernie Sanders kind of social democrats. They just have the legacy of being La Resistance and fighting Hitler, and being, the Communist Party at one time. And they're probably very much overrepresented in the French intelligence services because communist activist kind of people are involved in civil society, feminism, LGBT, and that the French Communist Party is a very important part of the French deep state and its activities around the world. And it's all very, very interesting. The fact that we saw the wave of anti-colonial uprisings and that in, the Union of Sahel states that has come into existence now with Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger, that was very much because France was so solidly part of the anti-Russia campaign. These former French colonies that were still like dominated economically and militarily by France. That's why we saw them move ahead and with Russian support assert their independence. And, Ibrahim Traore, this great African leader, I mean, he's just doing amazing things in Burkina Faso. It's very much a result of the fact that France was all on board with the war against Russia. And so Russia, as a supporter of anti-colonialism, they very much supported, moves against France. It's very interesting. French imperialism and U.S. imperialism are not on the same page. The British and the Americans, they dominate the international oil markets, right? Oil, that's oil banking. That's the Atlanticist, British Empire, American economic order. The French have liked nuclear power because they don't want to be dependent on American and British oil, right? BP and ExxonMobil and Shell. I mean, the oil markets are dominated by the British and the Americans. The French have been some big supporters of nuclear power. And that has been a kind of a defining difference between them. And the military industrial complex in America also likes nuclear power, right? And that big oil tends to be liberal, but also kind of globalist in its orientation. It's interesting to see how these things play out. At the end of the day, World War I and World War II, the root cause of both conflicts was that the British and the Americans wanted to maintain dominance over the European mainland, right? And Germany was an up-and-coming imperialist power at the time of World War I. And they wanted to be colonizers and imperialists as well, right? The British, the American, and the French were ahead of them in the game, and so Germany was up and coming. After World War I, Germany was stripped of its colonies, and then with Hitler, they started re-seizing their colonies and reasserting themselves as an imperialist power, and so you had World War II, and that rivalry between the European mainland and the British and the American, like Atlanticist sea power. That is kind of the defining division in the Western countries. We have this notion since the Cold War of the so-called collective West, but we're not collective, right? And I think the people on the European mainland are a bit different than America and Britain. And that the new right that we're seeing rising in Europe, that seems to be the issue there. They're not socialists or communists. They're on the right. They're not Nazis either. They're the European mainland. They're saying, look, we're British, or we're French, we're German, we're Belgian, and we don't feel a need for our country to be economically tied in and dominated by the projects of America. And we'd like to have our own independence. And the fact that Biden blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, I mean, that wasn't just an attack on Russia. That was an attack on Germany, telling them they can't import natural gas from Russia, which is right next to them. They need to import natural gas from the other side of the world. Well, that's an attack on their sovereignty. I mean, the Germans should be able to buy natural gas from whoever they want. And it does, economically speaking, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to import natural gas from the other side of the planet when Russia is right there. But I guess they have to, because they've been kind of press ganged, forced into the US British anti-Russian crusade. And it's all very interesting.
They don't seem to be press gang. Merritt seems to be willingly singing a tune as he joins into this.
But there's a lot of Germans who don't agree. I mean, there's a lot of Germans who would prefer Germany work in its own economic interest, and they're not allowed in the political process, right? I mean, and that's what the AfD is really about. The AfD are not Nazis. I mean, maybe there's some fringe elements that are, but for the most part, the AfD party in Germany is just Germans who say, no, European Union, NATO, this isn't good for Germany. And there's a lot of French people that support, the National Front and Marine Le Pen, because the same kind of thing, right? It's just kind of like, and they're thinking in terms of our national interest. We're not benefiting from this kind of globalism that ends up being dominated by the United States and Britain.
What do you make of? I don't think I had the opportunity to talk to you about the national security strategy. I don't think it was out the last time you were on the show. What do you make of that document? I mean, I guess there are a few questions on it, but let's start at the beginning. What do you make of the flat document in and of itself, beyond whether or not the document is actionable, beyond whether or not it's would be accepted by, let's say, the blob, or the president has the power to do anything to effectuate any of that stuff that's in the document per se?
Well, I like it. I mean, I like it. I like the language of it. I like the idea that, undermining the logic of NATO and all of that. I will say, I just put it, unfortunately, I'm starting to get a little bit jaded, because Trump has said many good things when it comes to Russia, but he hasn't done it, and it's like, so we got this peace deal. I mean, Congress just passed all this money for Ukraine in the National Defense Authorization Act. Well, if the war is going to end, why did we just give Ukraine $200 billion or whatever? Like, something's, I keep hearing Trump say really good things, and I see Kirill Dmitriev coming over here, and I hear all this hope and all this, but then it doesn't happen, and so I like what I'm hearing. I think it's great what was said in the national security strategy, and I'm sure the Europeans feel very dissed by it and are very upset about it, and that's all well and good. But I'd like to see that the war actually end. Like I'd like to see actual concrete action, and that the performative stuff only goes so far, and that Trump has done a lot of that. There's been a huge amount of performative measures when it comes to opposing NATO, when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine. Let's actually see it happen, right? I mean, it seems like now there is a deal on the table that is realistic, but it's taken some time here. I mean, it's been how long? I mean, so let's see.
But this deal isn't really realistic. I mean, the idea that Russia is going to give up hundreds of billions of dollars and give the U.S. a kickback is outrageous. Like, the fact that's even in the document on some level gets across. It's not being serious.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to be excited, but I just keep getting excited over these little statements that are made, gestures, diplomatic words, and it's like, okay, we've heard optimistic, hopeful diplomatic words for about a year, but it doesn't actually happen. So let's either see it happen or not, and I'm getting tired of the performance. And to some degree or other, I mean, it says to me that it looks to me like to some degree or other, Trump isn't really running things. And that's kind of what everyone was saying about Biden. Who's really running the country? Well, it looks like Trump is not really running the country either. There are other forces there that are entrenched and powerful that have the ability to nullify things. And yeah, I mean, it's not good.
Or Trump was never being serious. I mean, like, it's one thing, like, one or two things is true. Either because Trump could have always walked. And I suspect that the controlling factor for Trump in walking is, okay, well, he doesn't want to get blamed for Ukraine losing the war. And so then you get a lot of performative stuff. And the problem that Trump has now is that Seversk has fallen, Vochansk has fallen, Pokrovsk has fallen, Leningrad is surrounded with mop-up operations. At some point, Russia will take Donbass. And this is like the last stronghold that Ukraine has, in which case the Ukrainian military is effectively collapsing. Okay, that's humiliating. Like, if you're a US president and this collapses on your watch, that is deeply humiliating. And so now you have all of these deals that are coming up with the idea of Donald Trump either trying to not look bad, but there's a question about whether or not he can accept Russian terms. I don't know if he could. I mean, like, for example, you mentioned a thing for Congress. Just because Trump may want a deal on his terms doesn't mean Congress wants a deal, in which case this is kind of a thumb in the eye of the president by them passing the National Defense Authorization Act, where they're giving, I thought it was like $500 million or $200 million, whatever that number is, but several $100 million to Ukraine. I don't know. I mean, I for a while now, I did not believe that Trump had the courage of his convictions. I didn't see him as a strong president. I saw him as a weak president that was pushed to and fro by either the people around him, by the media, etc. Like, he may have these theatrical moments, but for all intents and purposes, if he's overly concerned about walking and putting it into this thing, then he is not the tough guy that I think people think he is. But give me your take on this.
Yeah, well, I think the most important constituency in America right now is what you call dissident MAGA, which is people that are Tucker Carlson fans, Marjorie Taylor Greene fans, Thomas Massey fans, that believed in America first and are angry that Trump is not carrying it out. And what shocks me, and I think this is just a result of the fact that we're in the information age, is how open-minded that crowd of people is. Right, those people tend to come from the right, but at this point, they are angry at the American political establishment. They voted for Trump because they wanted to end the wars. They don't trust the wars. They don't trust the FBI. They see our freedoms being taken away. And they're willing to hear narratives that generally people on the right would just completely dismiss. I mean, a great example would be Tucker Carlson embracing the Uhuru movement, right? The African People's Socialist Party. This is a Marxist Black revolutionary organization. That's the kind of person that, Tucker Carlson would just completely not pay attention to 10, 20 years ago. But Tucker Carlson, as dissident MAGA, did a huge amount to raise awareness about their case on Fox News and then later on his own podcast. And that was amazing, right? And that the dissident MAGA crowd are really, really important, and I think that is who we need to be figuring out how to talk to, right? The left is the left, and the left has really deteriorated in the last decade. And I've watched the left just completely, there's not much anti-establishment sentiment on the left. The cancel culture, the left has just deteriorated, and that there's a lot of MAGA that are just blindly supporting Trump. But there's a large constituency of people I'm calling dissident MAGA, and they are very, very important. And what does dissident MAGA do? And I think people need to pay attention to them. My concerns, I feel like Marjorie Taylor Greene, to some degree or other, the reason that I think she stepped down and she's leaving Congress in January is because she realized that she was falling into a trap where she was going to have to either become part of the Democratic Party's anti-Trump stuff or just fall in line and obey Trump, but she could do neither of those things, right?
Yeah.
So to maintain her integrity, she left Congress. You know, and you know, there's the whole thing with, you know, the people that maintain that Charlie Kirk was killed by Israel. There's a strong case that can be made for that. I don't embrace that necessarily because I don't know, and I want to stay away from things I don't know, you know, unless I know something for a fact. I don't want to, you know, embrace something. But the people who make that argument, you know, the Candace Owens crowd, they make some very, very strong arguments that the killing of Charlie Kirk came from Israel, and they strongly believe it. And that there's a large number of people in the MAGA camp who do oppose Israel and believe that Israel, you know, purged Charlie Kirk to some degree or other. And this is really, really important. If we're trying to build a real anti-war movement in America, dissident MAGA is very, very important. And that's why I'm very disappointed with the hands-off Venezuela protests right now, because there's absolutely no effort being made to include them in it, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene opposes attacking Venezuela. Thomas Massey, Rand Paul opposes attacking Venezuela. But the hands-off Venezuela movement, I mean, there was a rally in LA and I looked at the videos. I didn't even see signs about Venezuela. The signs were all about ICE, you know, you know, and it's just like they're trying to fit hands-off Venezuela into Trump derangement syndrome. Whereas if you listen to the people that want to drive out Trump, they think he's not regime change oriented enough. Right. You know, and I mean, the idea that the Democratic Party is a friend of Venezuela, I mean, that's ridiculous. It was Obama who put on the crippling sanctions. But there is this misleadership. I would say the so-called left is dominated by elements that are waging a culture war against middle America. And they are just so determined to wage that culture war, they will not, you know, in their minds, to be a Democrat is always 1,000 times better than being a Republican, no questions asked. And in the era of Trump, that's not true necessarily. I mean, in some cases, you could argue it is, but it's not true necessarily. And that Trump, despite, you know, not fulfilling it, Trump did position himself in a way that he appeared to be anti-establishment. And that many people voted for him because they don't trust the FBI, because they wanted to end the wars, etc. And the misleadership of the left, namely Brian Becker and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, they are just operating in a way that there is no room for such people in the left. They will not build a coalition. You know, and then their response to the Rage Against the War Machine protests in Washington, D.C. in 2023 was absolutely horrendous. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. The establishment pulled out all the stops against that protest like you wouldn't believe, because it had Chris Hedges there, because it had Dennis Kucinich, but it also had Tulsi Gabbard, and it was an attempt to build a more broad anti-war coalition. And the response to it was unbelievable from both the establishment and the so-called left. You know, and I mean, that's the problem. We need to build a real anti-war movement that includes people from dissident MAGA, and the refusal to do that, and the idea that all the dissident MAGA are all just racist and they're just bad people. It's not that simple. It's more complicated. Yes, there are racist people in that, but you know, people can change their views, and people may be forced to acknowledge new realities as they come to question the system. Things are more complicated than people realize, and that is one of my biggest critiques. I feel like, you know, if we had a hands-off Venezuela movement that included the MAGA, dissident MAGA elements, or even the pro-Palestine thing, the message of the pro-Palestine protests should have been money for jobs and schools for America, not weapons for Israel. And I think a lot of MAGA people would have agreed to that. But instead, it was almost like the pro-Palestine movements were being organized in a way to push MAGA people to support Israel. It was like, you know, we hate America. America's evil and racist, just like Israel. You know, and if you really hate America, you should hate Israel too. You know, it was almost like they were like doing everything they could to make the rallies as unappealing to MAGA people as possible. And that's misleadership.
What do you think happened to the left? Because the left wasn't always that way. I mean, you know, in my mind, growing up, the left was, and I don't mean Democrats, I just mean the left. And by the way, I know Brian Becker. If I'm not mistaken, I used to work with Brian Becker. I am unfamiliar with the organization. So maybe I need a little bit more clarity on this. And maybe this fits into the question that I'm about to ask on this idea of what happened to the left. Is it just that everything is reflexive So it's no longer we have an ideology, we have a platform, we have a belief set, etc. Instead, somewhere along the way, it became the beliefs are entirely reflexive to our opposition. In which case, if our opposition changes their point of view, then our beliefs change. So if Donald Trump takes a political positioning of, well, I want to stop wars, whether he believes it or not, then the other part becomes we're more pro-war, we're more pro-Ukraine, we're more pro. We don't want anybody to say anything about the Gaza genocide. We don't want. We're okay with getting rid of Maduro, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think happened in this case? Because something obviously changed.
Well, I think after the fall of the Soviet Union, a process that had already been, in the works during the Cold War, which was the West hijacking leftist values and leftist sentiments to serve imperialism and to justify imperialist interventions, that escalated because left and right were almost defined during the Cold War by your relationship to this big, huge international entity called communism. When that international entity called communism was gone, something that had already started with the neocon Trotskyites and the Congress for Cultural Freedom kind of escalated, which was the U.S. waging its interventions in the name of left-wing values, right? We're bringing down a dictator, that people are fighting for freedom. We're going to liberate the women. We're going to liberate the LGBT people. We're going to spread human rights. That became the narrative that the Western imperialist countries used to carry out their interventions, right? And the George Soros kind of color revolution, Revolution Incorporated activist apparatus became a really big part of U.S. foreign policy. And on top of that, I think also there's the experience of the new communist movement. I've written a lot. I have this book on the new communist movement, party building in 1970s America, and that there was a layer of people that coming out of the 1960s they did the right thing. They went out of their way to try and build a mass movement among the American people against imperialism. And it didn't work, right? And they got jobs in factories with thousands and thousands of people, tried to form new communist parties and such. And the American people didn't want to hear it because the U.S. economy was still very, very strong. And there were a couple places where they did have success, like Detroit, I think, is probably the city where the new communist movement was the most successful, with the election of Coleman Young and the Wildcat Summer of 1974. But largely, the American people didn't want to hear it, right? The U.S. working class was still prosperous enough in the 70s that becoming anti-imperialists and revolutionaries was just not something they wanted to do. And at the end of the 70s, you had a big economic downturn, and that led to the rise of Ronald Reagan and the American working class becoming more conservative and more anti-communist. So based on that experience, a lot of the people that now lead communist groups in America, they operate on the assumption that it just can't be done. Average Americans can't be won over, because we tried that in the 70s and it didn't work out well. And there's some really tragic stuff. 1979, there was an event called the Greensboro Massacre, where, a group of communist activists, they had a death to the Ku Klux Klan rally, and the Klan showed up and shot 5 of them on live television. And the Klansmen were acquitted, and there was a lot of cases of these very dedicated communists trying to do the right thing. But the atmosphere politically in America was just, there was enough of a prosperous white middle class that didn't want to hear it, that you didn't have a revolutionary movement. And so now much of the communist left operates on the assumption that the masses of Americans are unrecruitable, and they just can't be won over. They're just racist. They benefit from imperialism. And then on top of that, there was so much violence directed against communists, right? In the 70s and 80s, the coming out of the 60s, the kind of people that were carrying the communist flame, they experienced so much violence at the hands of Christians and right-wing Americans that they're almost traumatized, and they see Trump. The idea that there'd be anything good about Trump or anything good about Trump's supporters is something they just can't comprehend. And I knew some of these people, and it's just, they have gotten into fistfights and they have been violently attacked. And as far it's like, this is how trauma is weaponized, right? Once people have experienced violence, once they know someone who's been killed, it's very, very hard to convince people to change their tactics and make an alliance or anything like that, right? There's a traumatic side to it, where they know someone who's been hurt, and they just kind of have a gut level reaction. Back in the 1930s, the Communist Party embraced American patriotism. They said communism is nothing but 20th century Americanism. We are the party continuing the traditions of Abraham Lincoln. But these communists that come out of the 70s, they would never say that, because they just have this gut level, like, people with American flags are my enemies. The people that push American patriotism want to kill me. And they have had traumatic experiences that have kind of drawn a line in blood where they just can't listen. And it's very tragic that they've been through that. And, but so there's that factor, along with U.S. imperialism kind of suddenly reinventing itself to carry out its interventions in the name of leftist values that a lot of the left they're just lost. They can't genuinely be populist or anti-imperialist because they have this kind of cultural opposition to the American public at large, and this kind of, cultural issue. And then on top of that, the imperialists themselves are hijacking the very ideas that they talked about for years. And so they're lost, And, I think about, do you remember when it was maybe 10 years ago at the Super Bowl, they had a performance that referenced the Black Panthers, like where they had Black Panther outfits or something. Do you remember this?
Maybe.
Like at the Super Bowl. Right. And I, at the time I was in touch with a lot of old communists, and, it was the Super Bowl had this halftime show that, was kind of pro Black Panther, pro Black Lives Matter. And, the response of all these old communists was just to celebrate, this is a huge victory. And I was saying, hold up. Like, you do realize the Super Bowl is like the most televised event. And like, this wouldn't have happened if very, very powerful forces had not decided this could happen. No. It's just a victory for the movement. That just shows that we're ahead. And it's like, no, like, and there's not a double take. It's just kind of like, there's this entity that a lot of the left have gotten to the point that there is this big, scary entity called the right wing. It's called the right wing. And it is just evil and scary, and nothing can possibly be as bad as the right wing. What is the right wing? They can't tell you what it is. What do right wingers believe in? They don't know, but it's this big, scary thing, and we must fight the right wing, and it's based on trauma. It's based on confusion, and they're just disoriented, right? A lot of the older folks came up in a time where the main enemy of the American government was anything left wing. That's not the way things present themselves. And now a lot of the countries that are opposing U.S. imperialism around the world do so on a kind of conservative basis, at least culturally. And so it's anything that's left wing is not de facto anti-imperialist. U.S. imperialism is not, necessarily presenting itself in a right wing way, and often hijacks left wing sentiments. And leftism as a movement is just completely disoriented and confused.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. I mean, I would imagine they would probably say, well, the Cold War was effectively criminalizing communists.
Yeah.
In the way that they were going after them. So it's not like they are taking this, and this was kind of like this pro-America stance to go after communists. It's like it's true blue American in order to go after a communist. Like, meaning they're not coming out of the stuff out of a vacuum per se. No, you can call it trauma, fair enough. But that trauma is real. Like that, they're not. Yeah. Caleb, man, always appreciate you, man. Sure. Always appreciate you joining me. Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author. He's director for Center for Political Innovation. Caleb, please let the audience know a few of your books.
Sure. Yeah. I was talking about The Danger of an American Years of Lead that I wrote about the Luigi Mangione case. I've got my book Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, which has gotten a lot of very good reviews. I've been on a lot of shows about this book. It got a lot of attention. And I actually have a website, calebmaupinbooks.net. So you can look at all my books on there, audiobooks, the whole thing. But yeah, Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org is my organization. We're actually having an event in New Jersey to kick off the new year, January 11th. So I hope people register and come. It's going to be great. Garland Nixon's going to be there. There's going to be music, speeches. I'm going to be honoring 4 local New Jersey anti-imperialist activists, lifelong, organizers and others. So it's going to be pretty awesome. So I hope people come to our event January 11th. And yeah, we're organizing. Now is the time to go out with an anti-imperialist message and say that, look, our enemy is not in Venezuela, it's not in Russia or China or Iran. Our enemy is the big banks and corporations, the big monopolies that are grinding this country into poverty and trying to march us into a new world war. And we need to build a broad movement against imperialism for a new America, reborn in connection with the rising new economy in the East. That's our message, and I hope people check us out.
Caleb, do you have time to answer a chat? Because I would imagine this is the biggest pushback.
Hit me with your best shot. Bring it on.
Well, the biggest pushback that I suspect you get is around this idea of let's say a broad coalition.
Yeah.
So this is the chat that came up. This is why I'm bringing it to your attention, because I'm curious on your take. It says, like establishment Democrats, your idea isn't to rebuild the left, but to bring in the right to you. It doesn't affect you. So, quote, race, unquote, isn't important enough to stop a coalition. What do you think? I mean, give me a take.
Well, that's interesting, right? And that, you know, I have an interesting reaction to that. Well, first of all, right, a lot of the cultural issues that are like kind of red lines are not racial issues. They're, you know, I mean, you know, they are issues that are actually, you know, to give you a great example, the biggest cancel I've ever gotten, the biggest cancel I ever received was I tweeted out, I said, you know, if you oppose gay marriage or you oppose abortion, I might disagree with you, but we can work together. You know, you're still my comrade. We can work together. And I was one of these very liberal commentators. I got blasted for that. It was over 1,000 retweets of every person. And all these people said to me, well, of course a white man would say that. And I thought, you know, there's a lot of black people that are against abortion. There's a lot of black people that are against gay marriage. And I thought, and I said, well, what about, you know, and you know, you think all the people at these pro-Palestine rallies, all those Muslims, do you think they're in favor of abortion? Do you think they're in favor of gay marriage? But there's this kind of assumption that if somebody is deemed oppressed, they must agree with the left on everything. That is not true. Right. There's a lot of social conservatism in communities that are not, you know, of color, and Trump that are not white. And Trump actually got a huge amount of votes from people of color, right? And that I don't feel that the activist left speaks for the entire, you know, black community, Latin community, Arab American community, Asian. You know, it's just that's not, but that's a common misconception, you know, and that, you know, I mean, the Nation of Islam, for example, you know, Minister Farrakhan spoke pretty positively of Trump, you know, and did the interview with Alex Jones where he didn't endorse Trump. That was a misrepresentation. He did not endorse Trump, but he, you know, seemed to have some optimism when it came to Trump, and that it's not so simple, right? And that I think, and the other thing that I've noticed is weird is that the rise of wokeism, one of the main targets, and you know, you wouldn't know this, you know, if you, but I mean, unless you pay attention to these things, which I know you do and I do, but a lot of people don't, is they've targeted black nationalists, right? There has been a huge effort to like purge black nationalists from the leadership of the Black Liberation Movement, calling them hoteps, right? That's the slur that they use for them, hoteps. Right. And, you know, that black nationalists are anti-LGBT, black nationalists are not feminist enough, black nationalists are crazy, they spread conspiracy theories, they're anti-vax, and that they're the woke crowd that is very much pushing anti-racism. They have targeted a lot of the black nationalist leadership that has been in the black community. And that's been a big push because they consider them to be too anti-imperialist. And in some cases, they just disagree with them on certain issues. And I find that to be interesting as well. Right. And that, again, there is what you can call the woke activist left. Right. They don't speak for a lot of the forces that have dominated black liberation. You know, I see people in the chat referencing the Black Panthers. You know, it's easy to support the Black Panthers now, right? Because it's been decades, 50 years later, right?
Yeah.
But at the time the Black Panthers existed, you know, at the time that Fred Hampton was being murdered, it was quite a difficult stance to support them. It took real courage to do so. But now, 50 years later, we can say, oh, you know, the Black Panthers were great. Oh, it's awful what the U.S. government did. you know, but at the time, it was very different. And, you know, the Uhuru movement, that's a great example. Now they are not socially conservative as far as I understand it. They tend to take more liberal positions, but even they, when the U.S. government came for them and raided their homes, Tucker Carlson stood up for them. And even Glenn Beck did a sympathetic segment on his show, and my organization, we supported them, but the left was absent largely. That there was a lot of the left didn't support them, and those who did, you know, it was like they put a statement out. That was it. You know, and it's like our ability to take anti-imperialist stances was on trial. I know they're having, I'm going to be speaking on their conference, their webinar on Saturday about repealing the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They're actually having a webinar December 13th, you know, tomorrow, about repealing the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They tried to use the Foreign Agents Registration Act to say it's illegal to question U.S. foreign policy. It's illegal to be an anti-war activist. And the left didn't do anything for them because of this cancel culture stuff. Well, they're connected to somebody on the internet that I heard was a cult or said this or that. I mean, it was really, really awful to see how the right defended the Uhuru movement, a leftist group, more than the so-called left did. But it's because they're anti-imperialist, because they took anti-imperialist stances, and that a lot of the left has just kind of become controlled. The foundation money, right? That's a big factor too, that a lot of leftist groups, they get foundation money. If the group itself is not funded by the government, their members all work in liberal NGO kind of places that are getting funded by the government, and they're afraid of getting purged. And yeah, it's certainly disturbing what has happened to the left. So I don't think that the concern that the person raised there, I don't think that is exactly right. I don't think I'm simply saying that racism isn't important. I'm saying that you can't equate embracing the radical left and the way the left is going with being anti-racist. I don't think the two things necessarily line up. That's my response.
Yeah, and I don't think it's trying to reach out to people who are like-minded doesn't necessarily mean that you're ignoring a racial element. At least I don't take it that way. That was never the way I took it that you were trying to explain it. Caleb, shout out to you, man. Thank you for that. Deeply
Thank you.
Appreciate you. You be safe. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you hopefully next week.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye. Shout out to